when the apprentice to the master printer left out the not on thou shalt not commit adultery, because they had a fight to say, let's all these Bibles were printed. They have one at the British Library. Yeah, it was from, I think, the 16th century this happened. They executed the apprentice. He was killed for it. That's really good. That's really good. There's probably some really good Buddhist wisdom in that.
Or a Native American.
Yeah, right. That's brilliant.
They were anticipating eternal life.
Yeah, there you go.
The voice of turtle.
Maybe it's starting to
Sure. I think we're
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mark has asked that we continue the tradition of introducing one another. So I'm going to introduce Matthew Coomber, who is a professor of Hebrew Bible at St. Ambrose, and he is well published on the topic of economic justice in the Hebrew Bible and has edited a couple of volumes that you can find in the bio sketches. But to introduce Matthew, I wanted to share a story about how I met Matthew. Which was actually in Baltimore. Matthew was part of a cohort of scholars that was hosted in Baltimore through the Poverty and Biblical World section of the Society of Biblical Literature a number of years ago now. It feels like a very long time ago. Yeah. So Matthew came to Baltimore and was hosted by the United Workers, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of minutes. But the thing that most struck another organizer that Matthew met that day was that Matthew had recognized that this other organizer, who's a colleague of mine, was wearing an earring of the Punisher, from the Punisher comic. Do you folks know that? And this other organizer was shocked that a Bible scholar like Matthew would recognize a comic book character. And he was very impressed by this.
That's really cool. Thanks. One has to have their side hobbies. So to introduce Crystal, and actually I had the exact same idea. A great way to introduce Crystal is to talk about the first time we met. Before that, I want to mention Crystal Hall. She's a PhD student at Union Theological Seminary. Yes, why did I blank on that suddenly? In New York City. And she's a research fellow at the Ujima Center in South Africa, where Gerald West does a lot of his work on contextual Bible study. And to introduce it and talk about this time in Baltimore, my first experience with contextual Bible study was through Crystal on this poverty tour that had been set up. And we went all over Baltimore and looked at various plights of different people who had suffered exploitation in the Inner Harbor area. We met with a man who had been a victim of wage theft, where he was an immigrant and had worked for several weeks on a construction site, and one day the van just stopped picking him up, and he had no idea where he could go to even try to find justice and collect his money. We dealt with someone else who had, and then he and others dealing with threats of sexual exploitation and enacted sexual exploitation of vulnerable workers. Camden Yard, where they were using horrible labor practices on the homeless and low-wage workers that worked there. We got chased away from an abandoned factory. What was that?
The steel plant.
Yeah, the steel plant, and that was interesting and made an exciting tour.
Was that Bethlehem?
Yes, Bethlehem Steel.
I grew up near there.
Right, yeah, they came out for security and escorted us off the property, but first they did give us a satellite image of the whole place so we could see it. But why I'm bringing this up in these stories is because contextual Bible study is Crystal's wheelhouse. This is what she does, and as a PhD student and growing force in the field, she is at the crossroads of scholarship and activism, and now as she's writing her dissertation, which is the final paper for those who are in academic circles, the final paper upon which your degree is judged. She's working with United Workers, which she's going to be telling you about in a moment. So I've been very excited over these last last few years to be able to learn about contextual Bible study, because Crystal's helped me remedy my issues with combining my scholarly life with my activist life. So, without further ado, Crystal.
So just to provide a quick overview of our next minutes together, I am going to give a couple words of introduction about the contextual Bible study methodology, just to ground folks in some of the principles that inform the work that I do and scholars and practitioners across the world do through this method. And then I'm going to say just a couple of words of introduction about United Workers, which is the organizing context that I am grounded in Baltimore. And we're going to show a brief video that hopefully will draw some resonance to the biblical text that we'll then be exploring. And then we'll go through a contextual Bible study process, but I want to provide a couple of caveats right at the beginning. Contextual Bible study is a process that is organic and takes time and is community-based. And so in the 45 minutes that we have together, I would love to have 3 hours with y'all and have a meal in between there so that we could really digest this text and read it in community. We can't do that today, and that's okay. So what we're going to do is I'm going to facilitate you through not so much the Bible study itself, but talk through what are the principles that inform each part of this study. So we're gonna do a contextual Bible study, but in brief and in principle more than in practice. So I wanted to provide those caveats up front before we launch in. So just so you have a sense, I've been reflecting over the past day or so about the fact that I'm probably one of the youngest people in the room. And just wanted to say a word about ancestors and lineage, because I think it's really important that folks know that my work is grounded both in the Ujima Center in South Africa and the history of the struggle of apartheid and the work that the central role that the Bible played in that liberation struggle. So my work is very much informed by Dr. Gerald West of the Ujima Center. It's also deeply informed by the history of poor people's organizing here in the U.S. context. I come from a set of organizations that traces its history back to the Poor People's Campaign of 67 and 68 under Dr. King, and then led forward by his lieutenants after his assassination. But those organizations trace their histories back even further to the women's suffrage movement and to the abolitionist movement. So I think it's important that we ground our next couple of moments also in some of these deeper histories, not only of struggle, but also of scholarship. So what I have for you here is just a couple of methodological principles that inform the contextual Bible study process itself. I think it's important to say that CBS begins with actual work in local communities of struggle. That is where CBS is grounded. It's grounded in communities of the organized poor, of the working class, of the marginalized. And then, after being engaged in that work, there also can be these conversations about theology. And then there can also be these conversations about what might the Bible do to provide resources for this struggle. So I think it's really important that we ground ourselves in them, that this is a process that has an explicitly liberationist hermeneutic, and is grounded in struggles of the organized poor themselves. And because it has a liberationist hermeneutic, it's not neutral. We're in no way trying to claim an objective interpretation of the Bible, but these are interpretations that take sides, because God takes sides, right? God takes sides on the side of the poor and the oppressed, and so it's our call to then come alongside that. And be on that side of the struggle. And one last thing that I'll say is that in the U.S. context, the Bible often does continue to create a sacred space. That's not always the case, but I think it's really important to recognize that in our U.S. cultural context, that because we are so many people in the U.S. continue to be deeply religious, that the Bible, the physical presence of the Bible, creates a safe and sacred space in some communities. And so I think it's important to also say here at the beginning that contextual Bible study is a process that attempts to create sacred space and that attempts to create safe space so that community can actually continue to grow and develop. And CBS is controlled by groups of the organized for themselves. It's not the Bible scholar that's constituting a process, but a Bible scholar arrives at this process through the invitations of groups of the organized for themselves.
Yeah, I was just going to add something to that as
Yeah.
well. Within that, and bringing the Bible into the context, in this case Baltimore and in the United States and in different areas of the world, one of the criticisms that I've received is, well, you're just taking the Bible and shaping it into the modern world. But if we don't do that, then we're going to live in an Iron Age society forever, or a first century Roman society. Within that criticism also, I think it gets rooted in a common, especially American paradigm, and by that I mean North American paradigm, of how the Bible should be read, that this is this thing that's set in stone and it has been dictated and all that can be done is received. But that goes against the very nature of how the Bible was constructed. And as you go into the Hebrew Scriptures, as you go into the Second Testament, you can see the interplay happening between books and how people were taking more ancient books and interpreting their own times. You certainly see Jesus doing that with Torah, and you certainly see Paul doing that with Jesus, but then also much further. So in many ways, this sort of activity harkens back to the roots of the Bible and the way the Bible was treated in the ancient world.
So, because we're not in a traditional contextual Bible study process, and because the group that is convened here is not necessarily an organization of the poor and the marginalized, that we're going to ground this study in a particular context, making that explicit, and also inviting you in your work in various struggles to also bring that into the conversation. So we're choosing the particular context of Baltimore to ground this study in, but I also invite you as we move into the discussion to be bringing your own contexts and the struggles in which you are each engaged into the conversation as well. So to provide just a couple of words of introduction about United Workers, it's a human rights organization that was founded in 2002 in what at the time was an abandoned fire station turned homeless shelter. And the first struggle that Matthew mentioned that United Workers was engaged in was organizing the temp workers at Camden Yards, the Orioles Stadium, for those who are baseball fans in the room. And at the time, Camden Yards and the Stadium Authority in Maryland was the largest employer of temp workers in the state. And after a several-year struggle, the workers there won a living wage for the workers there. And moved on to the Inner Harbor, where they organized against the ESPN zone, which actually violated federal law, in closing its stores overnight. ESPN, as you know, is owned by the Walt Disney Corporation. And so the workers there organized against Mickey Mouse over a number of years and won a settlement from the Walt Disney Corporation in that process. And so what's been important for us is to move beyond these workplace struggles, to connect where people work and where people live. And so we've branched out to a number of other areas, including housing work and environmental justice work, as we continue to organize around work with dignity issues. So the video that I'm going to play now is a testimony that was given by one of our leaders, whose name is Chantress Wise. And this was at a speak out specifically about housing issues in the city of Baltimore. So I'll go ahead and play that.
they promised us that we would come back into the home after they finished rehabbing the home, but that was a broken promise. They raised the rent the other time that we were paying, and we never came back into that neighborhood. And on that block, there was a long-term resident also that lived there since 1960. And they pushed her out as well. My second experience with that broken housing system was when I lost my home back in 2010. And I was a housekeeper. And I took off the surgery. And when I took off the surgery for 2 weeks, my job paid me all my time. Paid time, leave, PTO, sick time. And when I came back within 2 weeks, I was no longer on the set. And I was 10 years working as a housekeeper. So that was the first time in my life that I started thinking to be homeless. It hurted me to lose my home. And I couldn't get help from anyone. I even resorted to sleeping in an emergency room of a hospital. I ended up in the current home shelter for women and kids, and went to assisted living from there, and then ended into transitional housing at Jesus Love, where I am not at today. Housing is a human right, not just for me or for others. We deserve dignity and respect. Housing should be affordable for everyone. I'm a part of the Housing Roundtable, and we've been studying solutions on housing crisis in Baltimore City. One of the things that we've been learning about this community land trust to help that community to stay with the community and for the people in the community. You can stay there as long as you want. You don't have to move from place to place like I did. No one should have to move from place to place because of a broken housing system that puts private gain over people. And we need to hold the developers accountable, not just to come in our community and take our housing and push them out over our homes. That's why we should stand up and unite as renters, homeowners, and homeless, and make our voices heard. We don't have to care about it. Housing is a human right. This is our truth, and we need to take it back.
So now that we've grounded ourselves in a particular context, at least in a very preliminary way, we're going to start our Bible study. Yes?
Hi. I don't hear very well, and that was completely unintelligible to me.
All right, there's a lot of echo with
So I don't know the context yet.
Hey, Joyce,
Oh, thank you.
summarize what you said?
Sure, absolutely. No, thank you. So there are others as well. Okay, so I'll summarize briefly. So Chantress shared her story about being forced out, being displaced from her home because she was priced out of her neighborhood because a developer bought up the block where she lived. And from that initial displacement, she then had to move several times over. And she has become one of the leaders in United Workers around housing and was making statements about the importance of housing as a human right. And the importance of bringing together renters and homeowners and homeless folks together so that they can build solidarity among each other in the organizing work. And she also mentions a proven solution for homelessness and housing insecurity, which is called community land trusts, which is it's a development model that guarantees that the development that happens in a particular community is actually owned by that community itself. And that community drives the development process, which is very different than the vast majority of development where we have a for-profit, out-of-town developer who comes in, jacks the rates, and then pushes people out. So community land trusts are a way of guaranteeing that the communities themselves own the development process. So thank you for that, and apologies for the technical glitch with the speakers. So thank you for that. So, to get into our first part of our Bible study, so if you go to your handout, on one side you have the biblical text, and then on the other side you have the questions of the CBS that we've developed for this workshop. So we'll start with, we're not going to go through this sort of question by question, because unfortunately we don't have enough time. So I'm gonna take us through and facilitate us through some of the questions, not all of them. So to get us started, I think it is really important that we read the biblical text out loud. This is one of those fundamental parts of Bible study. So we'll start with Mark 12, 41 to 44. So if you'd like to use the handout, please do that. Or if you'd like to use a Bible, you're welcome to do that as well.
Does anybody else need a handout?
So who would like to read for us Mark 12, 41 to 44 to get started? Yes, thank you. Nice and loud.
He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. The poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on."
Great, thank you. So with this first question, we would popcorn a number of responses of what is this text about, gets us to the second question, which is sometimes used in these kinds of texts where there's already a long history of interpretation. So I'm sure you've heard this text preached. And so this second question, you may have heard this text preached or worked with it in a Bible study. If so, how have you heard Mark 12, 41 to 44 interpreted? So I would invite a couple of responses here. How have folks heard this text interpreted? Yes?
Whenever we have a pledge drive,
Yes.
this text can be used.
Yes, so in stewardship discussions, in churches, absolutely. How else have folks heard this text preached or teach?
Link to the destruction of the temple in the next section.
Yes, linking it to the destruction of the temple. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, just any kind of system that requires this kind of extraction from isn't going to stand.
Yes, thank you.
I've seen it as an intertextual thing with the widow of Zarephath story in Elijah, because Elijah says she thinks she's going to starve, she's about to make her last meal for herself and her son, and Elijah says, "Cook me dinner," and she's like, "Really?" And he, says, "Yeah, cook me dinner," and she goes ahead and does it, even though she thinks she's going to die because of it. So it's compared because it isn't out of the abundance, it's giving out of really serious scarcity.
Yes, yes. Maybe one or two other responses before we move on.
I've preached this as a criticism of the system there, that the widow could have been cared for by the establishment in the temple, and they Instead, they were exploiting her.
Thank you.
As a rationalization for the limiting of national foreign aid, because the people will pick up the burden.
So this is our particular context in which there's already very progressive interpretations out there, right?
Well, let's go with the classic.
Yes.
This woman is a perfect example of faith and trust, and she is demonstrating virtue by giving her only coins to the betterment of God and the temple.
Thank you. Yes. So the purpose of asking these couple of questions up front is to suss out exactly these kinds of traditional interpretations about stewardship and about piety and about faithful giving and all of this, I think, pretty dangerous interpretation of this text. So in this first part of a CBS, what really is the purpose is to get at not only these received interpretations, but where the community is at itself. And so this first part is about community consciousness. It's about drawing on the local interpretive resources of the community itself. So that's where we start, is around community consciousness in this first part. So now we make a transition to part 2. And what happens in part 2 is where we start to develop critical consciousness. So in part 1, we're dealing primarily at the level of the text itself. And then in part 2, this is an opportunity in dialogue with the community as questions come up from the community itself for the socially engaged biblical scholar to provide knowledge, either through literary analysis or through socio-historical analysis, to provide what's outside the text, what you might not be able to glean immediately from the text itself. So there's a couple questions here. We'll deal with 3 and 5 in this for our purposes today. So let's start with 3. Which is read Mark 12, 38 to 40 aloud. Are there connections between Mark 12, 41 to 44, and Mark 12, 38 to 40? If so, what are they? So let's start by reading Mark 12, 38 to 40 aloud. Who'd like to do that?
As he taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation."
Thank you. So, same idea here. If there's a couple of responses to are there connections between Mark 12, 41 to 44 and Mark 12, 38 to 40? If so, what might they be? Yes.
I think there are critiques of the practices of the established classes. The scribes were relatively rich. The dimension of the story of the widow is that it's an implicit critique of the degree of honor that is being given to those who contribute large sums, and that is inappropriate because of their abundance, but that the one to be honored is the one who's giving out honor. So it's an implicit major critique of the structures of wealth.
When I think of scribes, I think of the media, and I think of not CBS but CBS in Baltimore, and how the media decided to exploit the image of the CBS burning while not paying attention to the fact that blocks and blocks of houses and houses had been demolished or were boarded up, and speaking again to the systemic injustice, and then that using apparatus like the media to exploit and flip the truth for public consumption.
Did you have anything as well?
Oh yeah, I was gonna say what it kind of reminded me, especially I thought of it before the word came up in the second one, but the appearance. So the performance of virtue when in reality you are not, contributing to, the betterment of the rest of society. I see the parallels today with these, millionaires, billionaires with all their charities, yet, Harvey Gray still wins in the US.
Just did a simple linguistic widows and their property. In the first passage, the widow had a house. In the second passage, she's only got 2 clients.
Yeah. Important point. Maybe one more response before we move on to the next question.
Well, the Bowery widows' houses did remind me of the history around the Salem witch trials. Because the historians have done a lot of work into the records, and the economics of that situation was that almost all of the women who were accused as witches were widows, and some farmer would be looking at the plot of land next door that, Goody Prescott or whatever still had from after her husband died. And all he had to do was, Goody Prescott put a curse on my cow, and then he could glom onto the property next door. And the pattern in Salem was like 85% that situation.
That makes me think of Nameless Vineyard.
Yeah.
Or the evil eye.
Evil eye.
So we'll skip over question 4 for the sake of time, which deals, I've done a little summary work just at the bottom of your handout. It's a summary of Mark 12. That should be 11:27 to 13:1. Apologies for the typo there. We bracketed off this particular literary section as a series of conflicts between Jesus as he enters the temple, has a series of conflicts with the Jewish authorities, and this gets at some literary analysis in terms of who are the main characters and how is the text describing them to ground us within that broader literary unit in which this passage is functioning. And then question 5 is in a lot of ways in dialogue with the our workshop from just previously around Deuteronomy 15. So question 5 reads, Mark 11 to 13 is characterized by conflicts between Jesus and the Jewish authorities. There is one interaction that's different. Read Mark 12, 28 to 34 aloud. What single word connects Mark 12, 28 to 34 and Mark 12, 38 to 44? Are there connections between these passages? If so, what are they? So let's read, assuming that we have now grounded ourselves in the literary unit of 11 to 13. Let's read 12, 28 to 34. Who'd like to read that? Thank you.
One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that he answered them well, he asked him, which commandment is first of all? Jesus answered, the first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Then the scribe said to him, You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, You are not far from the kingdom of God. After that, no one dared to ask him any question.
Thank you. All right, so we're working under the assumption that we would have allowed this text to marinate a little bit and that we would have heard this text several times at this point in the process, and it would be in your ear. So I'm going to give you a hint about what that word is that connects 12, 28 to 34. That whole passage. What's the word from 12, 44 that connects to 12, 28 to 34. I don't know sign, I'm sorry.
Devour.
Scribe, yep, scribe is one word. And say it again?
Devour.
Devour. Looking for another word. In some of your translations, it'll be all. In some of your translations, it'll be every. In some of your translations, it'll be some variation on that. So the word in Greek that actually connects these two passages is holon, which basically means, like I said, all or every or completely. And this is a word that only occurs 19 times in Mark, and it's actually concentrated. Over half of those occurrences are in these two of these verses in Mark 12. So when we have the Shema, right, that Jesus is quoting the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Quoting Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, and then adding to that, right, by quoting Leviticus 19, saying love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a stream in scholarship that thinks that with this all, this holon, connecting these two, because remember the widow says, the widow gives all, right? She gives her whole life, all. So connecting it back to our previous passage, Deuteronomy 15, and these calls in Torah that to define justice as care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Again, I'm kind of making some exegetical leaps for us for the sake of time. How might these passages further connect with one another? What do we do with some of those connections?
Takes a while for it to marinate.
Yeah, I know we're processing a lot right now.
But I think that the whole, the all reminds us of commitment.
Mm-hmm.
That if we're to love God with our whole selves, even as the widow gave all that she had, etc., etc.
I would build up on that with the wider point of, a commitment to, your larger community and, the condemnation that Jesus has for these wealthy men, like this slave, like in the earlier passages we read that they did not love their neighbor, they did not treat these women the way that God would treat them. And so it's like hammering in that point.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the reciprocity that Torah is calling for in loving your neighbor as yourself is absent here. Absolutely.
There's an interesting play on the word all, at least in the English translation. In Mark 41 to 44, in that very last line, when Jesus said, all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. And so there's this interesting dynamic between abundance and the wholeness of all that I am, all that I have, that's reflected back into the passages from the Hebrew Scriptures, the Shema and the Love Your Neighbor passage. So there's this tension of abundance and allness, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
Right here and then over here.
In both of those passages, Jesus is talking about really showing demonstrative offerings. In the first one, he's talking about how this is much more important than all burnt offerings. Burnt offerings are big and showy. And the second one, he's talking about. Every time I picture the scribes putting large sums of money, I'm picturing like bags of coins getting thrown in very,
The noise of the coins
the
going
noise
in.
of the coins,
Sure.
the size of the money. And showiness. He's talking a lot about the showiness of those offerings.
Tom, and then we're going to move on to the third part.
We're thinking of this in relation to the earlier discussion about the social structures, that the scribes were responsible for the administration of the legal system, and that this is a protest against the perversion of the law to operate against rather than for the poor, and that is directly related to what was going on in Deuteronomy, and so there's a straight line of continuity from the Deuteronomy legal system and what was happening here in terms of the possible perversion as well as
People who think they're smart because they don't pay taxes.
Oh, interesting. Norman, and then we're going to move on to the final part.
Not naming any names.
Two things. One is the scribes are condemned, and it gives a long list of the terrible things they do. But then one of the scribes came near, and he ends up not being far from the kingdom of God. So it's a phenomenon in the Gospels. You occasionally have Pharisees. One comes in as beware of Herod that rock. And so all the Pharisees aren't bad, and all the scribes aren't bad. In the actual story.
Well, how not far is he? Because is he just on the other side of the knives and needle?
Right, and you find this other places. Thank you. You find this other places, like in the Exodus narrative, right? It's Pharaoh's daughter who saves Moshe from the river. But I hope I don't take us off here. But how can this relate? What Norman's pointing out, how could this relate, whether or not it's agreed with, but at least to sit with that idea to the people of Baltimore who are dealing with these situations?
Well, I'm not sure about Baltimore, but devouring the widow's house, I think this means that she has inherited the property, but she can't care for it, unless there's some relative or some friend who will care, then she's taken care of. But I think that once your release is not practiced widely, that treasury was also not only to support the priest, but to support the poor.
Right.
And so they're all tied together, Tom says.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There's so much more to talk about here in this passage, and I'm looking forward to talking with you over meals and breaks about the exegetical nuggets in here. And to conclude in the last 2 minutes here, I want to bring us to what would be the third part of the process, and that is the return to community consciousness. So this is where things wrap up at the end, and this is where it's so important to be working with organized groups, because it is the group itself that owns this third part of the process. And this is where we make those hermeneutical leaps between all of the literary and historical work that we've now done with the text, and taking that forward into the contemporary context. And so this set of questions is around the so what. This is the what do we do now? How does this relate to our context? And then how do we actually take what we have learned and the community that we have created and deepened through this process and take it forward into specific actions that are owned by the group itself. So that's where a study like this ideally ends up. And so I will conclude there, because I want to be respectful of time in the next session coming up. But Matthew and I are certainly available to continue to talk about this. We've got lots of examples of work that we've done together to develop curriculum in Baltimore. And if you have any last words.
Just one really quick one. I had the honor of being invited to participate in a Contextual Bible Study a couple of years ago. It was an Advent study on housing. And one of the things it taught me is exemplified in Mark 12:41. Speaking of Jesus, he sat down opposite the treasury and watched. Our whole time here together was kicked off beautifully by Jennifer and Rick talking about being in places of privilege and working with systems that have supported us but are unjust. Gutierrez refers to this verse as such an important thing that Jesus does here. Jesus doesn't go and assume the situation. He sits and watches. And as an academic, that's something that Contextual Bible Study does for me. It forces me to sit and listen to the poor, to the displaced, and not assume I'm the white man coming on his horse and I'm going to save everything. I know nothing. And that's one of the beautiful things about CBS is the reciprocal educational process that happens. It's very powerful.
And you know, an action that could be taken would be just to find out what foreclosures are occurring in your neighborhood.
Right.
For instance, in Berkeley, where we live in the hills, there probably are few, if any, foreclosures. Down in the flats, there will be foreclosures.
Right.
Yeah.
And unless I make a point of learning about that, I don't ever see those.
Right. And
Ferguson, Missouri is an interesting model as well. There are some cooperative community housing projects that have sprung up, often in the most devastated, blighted, if you will, areas where you could get a really nice, large home with everything working for $38,000. And so what has happened is that people of color, including Black and Brown Solidarity, have purchased houses, and then they each take ownership of these houses. So church communities, mosques, synagogues, we could look to dig into our pockets to help assist. That would be a great idea.
thank you.
Laura's got a final word.
It seems to me that contextual Bible study would go hand in hand with the speaking or the telling of the story. Because it's an extremely powerful way, and people love to hear stories, and they remember them better. So I think that would be an interesting plus for your literate groups. So thanks, that's it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If we had more time, I would suggest that we actually read this in parts, because I think it would be an interesting way to, I mean, and there are lots of ways in which CBS actually uses exactly those kinds of performative methods, so thank you for that.
I'm going to put these on the back table.